On this Tuesday morning, a very, very good morning to you, and thanks so much for tuning in. So the Institute of Race Relations is warning against the state's use of prescribed assets as a rescue plan for government's obligations and state-owned enterprises. This comes after President Ramaphosa said a discussion needs to be held on whether various resources could be used to generate growth. He says Cosatu supports the policy. Marius Roodt, head of campaigns at the Institute of Race Relations, joins us on this discussion. Good to have you. Thanks so much for coming in.
No problem.
So, what do you sort of believe is the right or the wrong thing to do? I mean, do we go the president's route or not?
Well, I don't think we should. The state shouldn't be using people's resources to pay for the mistakes the state's made, and the state needs to do things itself to. So it needs to look at, for example, cutting spending. It needs to create an environment where investment and economic growth and jobs will be created. That's the only way we'll be able to get out this mess we are. Taking people's pensions, even if it's only a small proportion, firstly, it's not right, and it's not a long-term or sustainable solution.
Yeah. So let's, I suppose, give a proper definition of prescribed assets and the ability to use prescribed assets to help the country out of its financial difficulties. Let's talk to the layman's terms.
Well, prescribed assets simply means that the government will say that your pension fund has to be invested in, say a developmental sector or developmental company, for example. So they could, in theory, say 10% of your pension must be invested in Eskom, for example. And this actually wouldn't be too hard to do because with, I think it's Regulation 28 of your pension, it already says only 25% of your money can be invested outside of South Africa. So it'd be quite easy for the government to change Regulation 28 and say now 10% must be invested in this sector or wherever, for example. So it wouldn't be too difficult to do. And it's got precedent in South Africa. Under the former apartheid government, prescribed assets were used at one stage, up to 60% of your pension assets were prescribed and told where they could be invested. So this obviously has implications for people who do have pensions. They'll have, their pension will be smaller when they do retire, or they'll have to work for longer to be able to retire with the money that they would have wanted.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, this is a massive public interest, this matter. This is of interest to everybody because this is your pension. This is your retirement money. Are there threats to it? I mean, could you suddenly see your pension disappearing?
I don't think we could go as far as say your pension would disappear, but your pension will definitely be smaller than it would have been if it was invested in well-run companies. For example, Alexander Forbes did some research and they showed, on average, if your money was invested in prescribed assets during the apartheid era, you got a return of about 7%. If it was returned in ordinary equities, you got a return of about 20%. So your pension will be a lot smaller than if it was invested in well-run companies. And at the same time, we must remember that pension funds and people who invest in pension funds would actually not be opposed to investing in infrastructure projects if they know that they'll get a decent return from these projects. Recently, Cape Town had what they called the Green Bond. They wanted people to invest in environmentally friendly infrastructure projects in Cape Town. And this was actually oversubscribed. So many people want to invest in it. So if people are confident that a company is well run, that they'll get a return on investment in 5 or 10 or 20 years whenever the project is finished, the governments could actually encourage people to invest in infrastructure. But people will not want to invest in companies where they don't really have faith in it, such as Eskom and most of our state-owned enterprises, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's quite interesting to see that, some of the trade unions, well, Cosatu is for this as well. What do you make of that?
I'd be surprised if ordinary members of Cosatu are for this, and I think it'd be quite interesting to see what the ordinary members think. I think the leadership of Cosatu is for this, and this is probably it's quite simple why they're for it, is because they are an ally of the ANC. So I think this is why they are supporting this. I don't think ordinary members of Cosatu will be as for prescribed assets as the leadership of Cosatu.
Yeah. It looks like this is what the country might resort to, though, because that's, it's been spoken about. I mean, if the president is already mentioning something like this, ANC economic policy head Enoch Godongwana said the ANC is investigating a policy of prescribed assets for pension funds. This is the reasoning is that this will be a way of avoiding turning to the IMF. Now, that is a big story as well. Would you prefer prescribed assets or we turn to the IMF? If those are the choices?
I think that's a bit of a stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think what the government first needs to do, though, is start doing things such as cutting spending, as I said earlier, and encouraging an environment where we can have investment and economic growth. If we do those things, we don't have to go to the IMF or start using people's pensions to plug funding gaps. So I think the government has to start making some hard choices itself. I don't think these are the only two options facing us, but the government does have some hard choices, and it's got to start doing things such as, I say, cutting back on spending and creating an environment where we actually do get investment, which will lead to economic growth and will lead to the creation of jobs, which is actually the biggest crisis facing South Africa, when 30% of people are unemployed, and actually nearly 40% if we go to the expanded definition of unemployment.
Yeah. Just finally, as we wrap up this conversation, I mean, there is a view that around the world, pension funds are used for developmental purposes, and it's not something strange. It is something that has been done and has worked successfully. So,
well, as I said, most pension funds and most people who invest in pension funds would be happy for their money to go to infrastructure projects or for developmental projects if they know that these projects are well run and they will get a return on investment. People will not want to invest in an entity such as Eskom, where it's throwing good money after bad. And I think that's the issue. Most people will not want to invest in our poorly run state-owned enterprises. If we know 15 years ago, most people would probably been happy to invest in Eskom. When it was still well run, it wasn't running huge deficits, its staff complement was fairly low. And I think that's the thing. People will be happy to invest in well-run companies, whether they're state-owned or not. But I think nobody will want to invest in a company where you don't know if you'll get a return on your investment or your money back at the end of the day.
All right, we'll leave it there. Marius, thanks so much for talking to us. This was Marius Roodt, Head of Campaigns at the Institute for Race Relations, cautioning against the use of prescribed assets by the government in dealing with the country's economic issues. Right, time now for your sports news with Valen, and lots to get through. We see who the Springboks